Aloha everyone, it's Ajanette, and this week we are going to be talking about personality disorders. Although our overall learning objectives for the course are to focus on the different personality theories and to be able to compare and contrast those theories, this chapter doesn't focus as much on the theoretical perspectives because remember, each of the theoretical perspectives that you have studied thus far are going to analyze personality from a different lens. So they have different explanations for what contributes to the development of your personality. Well, the same is true for personality disorders. Different theories explain the development of a disorder. They also treat disorders differently based on that theoretical lens. So while this chapter doesn't go into the theoretical perspectives, your activity will allow you to explore these disorders from different theoretical perspectives. So that said, let's dive in. Your reading is going to be your reading and lecture as drawn from the Allen textbook this week. You're going to be looking at chapter 9, personality disorders. We'll focus on Allen for the other portion of this module as well. Let's start with a little bit of background. So interestingly enough, Allen actually draws on a different text altogether for personality disorders. And the way in which they define personality for their chapter is talking about a characteristic manner of thinking, feeling, behavior, and relating to others. So again, it's looking at our thoughts, our emotions, our behavior, and our relationships and social engagement and interactions. It's important to understand how one defines personality to understand how a disorder might emerge. So disorders will be involving thoughts, feelings, behaviors, and social interactions and relationships. So all the disorders that we'll talk about will have some disruption to any one of those components. Additionally, when we're talking about traits, we're talking about characteristic and routine ways of thinking, feeling, and relating to others. So those integral ways or characteristics that we each possess that makes us uniquely us, right? That reflects the things that we value, that reflects how we kind of think about things and how we think about the world, that reflects our activities, our interests, the things that we engage in, and that reflects kind of the core elements of our individual lives, right? Now, this also takes us back to that 5-factor model, and I have this interesting graphic here. I'm sorry, it didn't come from the Erickson Institute, so I'll have to change that. But I have this interesting graphic here that looks at the spectrum of each of the 5 traits from the big 5-factor model of personality that we studied early on in the semester. And notice that you can have neuroticism, which is really referring to emotional instability, and then the opposite end is emotional stability. People can range from varying degrees of extroverted to introverted, from being open to kind of being closed-minded and having very kind of concrete, practical, set ways of kind of viewing and engaging the world. You can have someone that's very agreeable versus someone that's very antagonistic. You can have someone that's very conscientious and responsible and reliable to someone that's a little bit more disinhibited, maybe neglects their responsibilities, isn't taking care of things as dutifully as they need to be, and not as reliable, right? So those different axons that we're going to focus on, and when you're talking about disorders, you're really talking about traits that are now expressed in distressful, dysfunctional, disruptive ways that are not consistent with a way to maintain healthy relationships, healthy thinking, healthy feeling, and healthy behaviors. So when we talk about disorders of any kind, not just personality disorders, but disorders of any kind, here in the United States, we rely on what's called the DSM. We're at the DSM-5 right now. So the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual is developed by the American Psychiatric Association. And so a psychiatrist is a medical doctor that focuses on psychiatric disorders, psychological disorders. So psychology is the scientific study of the brain and human behavior. It focuses on psychological disorder. It also relies on the DSM. So the American Psychiatric Association develops the diagnostic criteria. You need a psychiatrist involved to prescribe any type of medication. So they treat the disorders from a biological perspective and a medical perspective. And then psychologists are the ones that are often therapists. Or you can have a clinical social worker, a clinical psychologist, and a clinical social worker. They offer therapy. So they do actual therapy. And so it's a different way of addressing any type of disorder, not just personality disorders. And they're going to draw on all of the theoretical perspectives that we've talked about. Some of them might practice more from a behavioral perspective. Some of them might practice more from a cognitive perspective. Some of them might practice more from a humanistic perspective. Some of them might practice more from a developmental or feminist perspective, right? So each psychologist practices a therapy through their own lens. So they're going to analyze disorders from a perspective of, what causes this disorder. It's going to be based on that theoretical perspective that influences their therapy practice. How do we treat the disorder? Again, it's going to be influenced by the theoretical perspective or lens that shapes and influences their therapy model. The DSM, what it does is it gives a specific criteria to define symptoms and diagnostic criteria for each disorder. It also shares prevalence rates. It also shares treatments that have been utilized that are most successful. And so it is a manual. It is the most relied upon resource here in the United States for diagnosing and treating all psychological disorders, not just personality disorders, but all psychological disorders. Now, in the world at large, the global community might use what's called the ICD-9 or ICD-10 now. It's the International Classification of Diseases, and that's designed by the World Health Organization. And many of our international colleagues will rely on that for diagnostic criteria. Now, many of the criteria from the DSM and the ICD overlap with one another, and there's a lot of commonalities, but there are disorders that appear in the ICD that don't appear in the DSM, and there are disorders that appear in the DSM that don't appear in the ICD. And there's certainly different cultural manifestations of disorders throughout various regions of the world. So keep all of that in mind. I want you to have a more global view and lens. For those of you that are going to be looking to maybe go into therapy and become a therapist yourself, it's really important that you have a cross-cultural lens and perspective. So maybe reviewing not just DSM criteria, but also ICD criteria could be really helpful. It could be a way to improve your cultural competency and understand how disorders might be manifested in other cultures differently and how the symptomology might appear differently as well. So as we become an increasingly more diverse society here in the U.S., as well as across the globe, the more we can understand about the various cultures and backgrounds of the people we're treating, the better. Okay, so let's dive in a little bit and talk about what is a personality disorder. So the DSM classifies different types of disorders, right? Anxiety disorders, depression disorders, dissociative disorders. Personality disorders are one type of disorders or one classification that really reflects fundamental aspects of one's personality. And so a a persistence in characteristics, traits, behaviors, thoughts that cause significant distress, that impair social engagement and relationships, and that may hinder or limit people's ability to be successful in the various work that they do. So there are a variety of symptoms that correspond to each disorder, and similar to something like autism, it can be kind of a buffet of symptoms, and each person might have different symptoms manifested in their disorder and might have varying degrees of severity of those symptoms. So we reference them more as a syndrome, right? Or a spectrum, because that reflects the variation and diversity of the disorders within one disorder. So paranoid personality disorder, we will talk about some general things that appear, but one person with paranoid personality disorder might manifest some symptoms, and then another person manifests maybe a couple of the overlapping symptoms, but different symptoms as well. This person has varying degrees, and this person has varying degrees. So they don't look exactly alike, right? Even though they have the same disorder. And that is important to understand. How the disorders are manifested from person to person to person may vary and may differ. And so the DSM gives you some general criteria, and then you have to make sure they meet the minimum criteria, but then they might also have different specifications that relate to their particular experience. These are some wonderful DSM fact sheets. You can actually go to this link and find a more detailed description of each of the personality disorders that we're going to cover today, and they'll give you more detailed information. We're going to focus on general descriptions, and then I'll let you use the learning activity to dive in to a more broad overall assessment of the disorder that includes prevalence, that includes treatment, potential causes, and you can use the DSM fact sheets here, other DSM resources, other APA, American Psychological or American Psychiatric resources, or other scholarly resources that you might find on the internet. But we do have 3 different clusters of personality disorders that you're going to see here. You're going to have cluster A, which includes disorders that are more consistent with things that you might see in schizophrenia. So paranoid personality disorder, schizoid personality disorder, and schizotypal personality disorder. Then you have cluster B that also has some overlap with other disorders that you might be familiar with. Antisocial personality disorder, histrionic personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, and emotionally unstable personality disorder. These might relate more to emotions and emotional expression, which can also impact relationships, right? Then you have cluster C, avoidant, obsessive compulsive, and dependent personality. And these are also largely relationship focused as well. And so we'll talk a little bit about each of these in general. So when we talk about overall prevalence of personality disorders, you're talking about 10 to 15% of the general population. And so that means that about 85% of the population doesn't have a personality disorder, right? So I think it's actually an increasingly high percentage and prevalence than what we may have thought of down the road. And I want to kind of break through some stereotypes and some perspectives that you might have about these disorders. 60% of people that are hospitalized, that are institutionalized, are diagnosed with some type of borderline personality disorder. And we'll talk about that. That tends to be one of the more common personality disorders that are diagnosed. Antisocial personality is more common in correctional facilities, in incarcerated populations, but it is important to note that most people with antisocial personality disorder are not necessarily violent criminals. We often think of antisocial as the serial killers, the murderers, and yes, that might be true that many serial killers and murderers have antisocial personality disorder, but the opposite is not true. Most people with antisocial personality disorder are not serial killers and are not murderers. So I hope you understand that distinction. It's subtle but important. And then additionally, it's important to note that when you do have a personality disorder, it might be more challenging for us to recognize, diagnose, and treat other mental health disorders that you may have. So in our field, we talk about something called comorbidity, and it means that people who are described with one may actually be described with more than one condition. So if you can think of something like high blood pressure, it's often comorbid, meaning it co-occurs with high blood sugar, with heart disease, with obesity. Those things co-occur together. And so when you're talking about mental health disorders, it's quite common that comorbidity exists, such that if you're diagnosed with one disorder, you likely meet the diagnostic criteria for other disorders. Depression and anxiety often co-occur, so they are considered comorbid disorders. So what this last bullet point is highlighting is that if you do have a personality disorder, it impairs our ability to diagnose and treat other mental disorders that you might also be experiencing. And here's another resource provided by Valley Spring Recovery Center that actually is consistent with the stats that you see in your textbook about the general percentage of our American population, which translates into roughly 31 million people. So a significant portion of people. And then this actually breaks down some of the more prevalent disorders. It does not list the prevalence of borderline personality, but as we noted here, that is the most common personality disorder. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about each of the disorders themselves. Now, note that each disorder has its own prevalence rates, its own etiology or causes, right? Its own treatments that tend to be most effective for this specific disorder. And so I will leave that to the learning activity for you to dive into these disorders individually and pull some additional detailed information to create an infographic about these disorders. And you all, as we're going through them, decide which one sounds most intriguing to you. So let's first start by talking about paranoid personality disorder. Key word being paranoid. Individuals with this disorder tend to have a pervasive paranoia. They have difficulty trusting others. They're highly suspicious of others. They might misinterpret motives and intentions as being intentionally trying to harm them, sabotage them. So they end up being very skeptical, very suspicious of potential relationships outside of the family. They might actually feel like you've harmed them, betrayed them. They might feel like you're after them, even though there's no clear objective evidence to that effect. It's often purely based on suspicion. And so they will have a lot of doubt, a lot of skepticism and concern about whether their friends or other people in their lives are trustworthy, are loyal. And so consequently, it might cause relationship disturbances. They might not want to share any detailed private information because they're paranoid about you potentially misusing that information in a way that harms them. They might actually be overreactive to situations where you make a comment that's fairly benign, that in other circumstances it would not be a big deal, but for them it's interpreted as threatening, demeaning, harmful, intentional. And so they might be very reactive. They might hold grudges. They're unwilling to talk about things or forgive things. When they feel like you have harmed them or injured them or betrayed them in any way, then they might lash back out at you very quickly and not be willing to work through to resolution. And so this relationship this disorder deeply impairs their ability to have a successful relationship. Schizoid personality disorder, these individuals will also often avoid social relationships. They might have very limited emotional closeness in their relationships. And so they may actually have very few close social connections because they actually don't want to be around people. They prefer to be very solitary. They're maybe sometimes described as loners, but they really do prefer not to engage with other people. So they very rarely have relationships outside of their family connections. They don't really try to start a relationship, and they don't put in effort to maintain a relationship. So even friendships that they may have may only be a one-way relationship, and they just literally don't have interest in engaging. And so that also extends to their sexual relationships, where they may actually not have any interest in having a sexual partner. They may have very limited emotional expression. And because they're not as centered on social connection, they could really care less what other people might think of them. So they're a little bit more immune to criticism, to critique, and even praise, right? So you praising them may also not be as inspirational or motivational to them either. So they very rarely show emotional responses, and they don't express themselves in the same way. So it's a very limited emotional expression. Some people might consider them to be, my mom calls them like cold fish, bland, blobby, and so there's research to actually show they don't even reciprocate with facial expression. So you smile, they smile back. They may not even be as responsive. So because of this, they have a very limited need for attention, for engagement, for acceptance, and for social connection. Okay, schizotypal personality disorders, which is our last one in cluster A. It also has social impairments, and these individuals are more uncomfortable. So not only do they not desire the relationship, but they're uncomfortable in the relationships. They also might have odd or distorted perceptions, maybe even some eccentricities. These individuals actually might have more schizophrenia type symptoms because of these ideas of reference, because of these perceptual distortions. And so they actually want to be alone and isolated and don't have a lot of relationships because of these oddities that exist. And so ideas of reference is when you think kind of things and events and connections are related to you. They're referencing you, right? And so, like you might think that something completely unrelated that's happening in the world is related to you, is referencing you. And so consequently, they have very odd beliefs and preoccupations. They may actually think that, they might have superstitions where they think if they do something, then it'll cause something bigger to happen. And so they may think that they have special powers, or they can influence special things or activities throughout the world. They might think they can read your mind, that they can control you with their mind or their thoughts, or control things like, turning a light green, or making something happen that we know is completely outside of their control, but they might think that they have some degree of control of it. They might actually experience auditory hallucinations. Again, this is why it kind of lends itself to a little bit of schizophrenia type symptoms, but it does not necessarily meet the criteria for schizophrenia itself. So you might see some unusual speech patterns because of those cognitive distortions, because of those auditory hallucinations. They also have some degree of paranoia sometimes, and suspiciousness that you might see in the paranoid personality disorder. And they also have some limited and restricted emotional affect. So when we talk about affect, we're talking right here. We're talking about emotional expression, right? So similar to the last disorder, the schizoid, that actually has limited emotional range, right? And these individuals actually have social anxiety. So not just a lack of social interest, but actual anxiety and discomfort. And so that's why they might isolate as well. So going back, let's go back here. This one is marked paranoia and skepticism and suspicion in relationships, which may cause distress in relationships. This one is limited interest in relationships altogether, and potentially just a disengagement. They're not really, they have limited emotional expression and not really responsive to either praise or criticism. In this one, they do still have some paranoia. And they actually experience social discomfort and anxiety, and may also experience hallucinations and cognitive distortions more consistent with that of schizophrenia. Okay, so let's move on and talk about some of the cluster B, antisocial personality disorder. You might hear individuals with this disorder referred to as sociopaths or psychopaths. But this is when individuals have a complete disregard for and violation of the rights of others. You start to see symptoms appear in childhood and persist into adulthood. You might have them start to show symptoms in early adulthood, but typically we see that before the age of 15, they are already displaying some of this disregard. And consequently, they behave themselves in a way that reflects the disregard. You cannot be officially diagnosed with this disorder unless you are 18, but there is conduct disorder that is often diagnosed with adolescents who have similar disregard for others, and consequently they violate rules, they break rules, they don't conform to rules. And they're constantly, violating social expectations. And so individuals who are diagnosed with conduct disorder have a higher risk of being diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder into adulthood. That doesn't mean that everybody diagnosed with conduct disorder is actually diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder. They just have a higher risk. But ultimately, they do not conform to social norms. You might see them with higher criminal records. This is, remember, we indicated that the individuals who are incarcerated in the criminal justice system are overly represented by antisocial personality disorder, and that can be due to property destruction, that can be due to assault where they actually harm others, even murder others. That could be them stealing because they really don't have regard for rules. And they can also be very manipulative and deceitful. Interestingly enough, although we often think of them as the serial killers, they're actually more inclined to be involved in some sort of scheme that's going to steal from you. So think of like Bernie Madoff, who, ripped off investors for millions of dollars. Or think of like the scammers that even try to like send you those texts, and then, they try to con elderly people into turning over their money. Many of those types of scams are conducted by people with antisocial personality disorder that have no regard for others, that could care less that they're harming people and stealing their life savings. They are perfectly okay profiting at the abuse of others. Individuals with antisocial personality disorder can also be very impulsive. They can make decisions on the fly and, engage in things without much thought or consideration. They don't think about the consequences. Consequently, they can be aggressive, irritable, reactive, right? They can, start fights, walk away from jobs, punch a boss, that's not uncommon. They don't really think about their safety or the safety of others, really. So they might be driving like maniacs on the freeway. They also might be perfectly okay driving after they've been drinking or doing other drugs. They're more inclined to engage in risky sexual behavior and not use protected sex. Even if they do have a disease, still engage in sex anyway because they really don't care about passing it on. They're also more likely to be addicted and abusive of drugs and alcohol. Don't have a lot of remorse, don't have a lot of sense of guilt, don't feel bad when they've harmed others. And in fact, they may actually blame it on you, blame it on the victim. The victim, it's their fault, right? They might minimize any concerns or fears or impact that they have, that their behavior has had on others, or be completely immune and indifferent to it altogether. So consequently, they come across as very selfish, very self-absorbed, maybe even superior, lacking a moral conscience, and that hinders their ability to maintain effective relationships. Know that they can also put on masks, right? So they might have healthy relationships in one domain of their lives, while they are hostile and aggressive toward others in other areas of their lives. Okay, borderline personality. Now, these individuals often have a high degree of neuroticism, emotional instability. They are very, very, I guess the thing that I'm going to really dive into for this one is insecurity, attachment issues, right? So they are so concerned about being abandoned and you leaving them, and they have this desperation to hold on to you that it might actually cause them to push you away. So their self-image is unstable, their emotional affect and expression is unstable. They might be expressing happiness 1 second and sadness and anger the next. And so that emotional roller coaster that can occur within the span of just a few minutes, they can flip a switch on a dime. It really becomes trying on relationships. Keep in mind, this is different than bipolar disorder. Bipolar disorder is not switching moods in, the snap of a finger. it's, they go through periods of mania and periods of depression. Borderline, literally, I hate you, I love you, from 1 minute to the next. You're my best friend, you're my enemy, you're attacking me, from 1 minute to the next. And that desperation and that fear of abandonment often drives that emotional switch and that emotional roller coaster. So they have difficulty maintaining healthy relationships as a result of that persistent fear of abandonment. And consequently, they might falsely accuse you of things. They might, get angry with you and irritable with you and for what you are like trying to figure out what the hell happened, right? So that fluctuating mood can be very confusing for outsiders. And then consequently, it might cause them to be volatile, reactive, and they may actually engage in self-harm or even suicidal behavior. They are more likely to attempt suicide and more likely to complete suicide than individuals with other disorders. That impulsivity and that emotional reaction is often what drives that. They also, again, might engage in things like cutting because it might help as a means of distracting them or maybe numbing their pain. They might also be very sexually promiscuous and impulsive in other ways. And, particularly like when they're really stressed or when a lot's going on in their lives, or maybe when they feel like a relationship is volatile, and they might seek out these alternative forms of unhealthy coping mechanisms. And so the relationships are much like Katy Perry. You're hot, then you're cold. You're yes, then you're no. You're in, then you're out. You're up, then you're down. I really think that song is describing a borderline personality disorder relationship. An ambivalent attachment. I love you, I hate you, all wrapped up in one. And sadly, they might also idealize relationships with people very quickly. So they're quick to get in relationships, and then those relationships are very volatile and unsteady and unstable throughout the time. They also might have sometimes hallucinations or delusions, often of a paranoia nature because of that insecurity that drives paranoia, that drives the belief that you're gonna leave me, you don't love me, you're out to harm me. So all of this is rooted in a deep-seated insecurity and a desperate need for attachment. Okay, histrionic personality disorder. This is really also relating to emotional fluctuations, but mostly centered around attention. So whereas borderline was centered around insecurity and attachment issues, this is centered around attention. I'm in desperate need of attention. I want all the attention on myself. I need that emotional feedback. And so I always want to be the center of attention, and I can be very theatrical and dramatic just to get that attention. Now, I do speak with my hands. I do not have histrionic personality disorder because I hate to be the center of attention. Professionally, I have to be, but personally, sucks ass. Not my thing at all. These people might make up stories. They might create some dramatic scene just to draw attention to themselves. They might dress in very provocative ways. They might engage in very sexually provocative ways. They might be very sexually charged and spend a lot of time making themselves look beautiful, attractive, desirable, sexy to others, to call attention to themselves, to get people to look at them, to pay attention to them, to note their value, their attractiveness. They may also be easily suggestible, and they can be easily influenced by friends and strangers alike, right? They might also just want whatever's in style, the flavor of the month. And so they want to constantly be in that, I'm popular, I'm doing what's popular. And then they too might exaggerate their relationships and think that even though, hey, we just know each other at work, they might view us as, having this meaningful, substantive relationship that we really don't have. Again, it's because they want to feel important. Okay. So let's move on to narcissistic personality disorder. So these are, this is the last one of cluster B. Narcissistic personality disorder centers around the narcissism. Narcissism is more than just an inflated self-esteem. It is a grandiose view of oneself, almost a delusional view of oneself, where I think I am more important, more valuable, more superior to others. Even if my achievements and accomplishments are small, I make them out to be just the cat's meow. And so consequently, they're boasting and they're raving and praising themselves and very pretentious and telling everyone about basically how superior I am. I think that I'm special and I'm unique and I have all these wonderful, admirable traits and qualities, and so consequently, you should excessively admire me. You should praise me. It sounds like I'm full of myself, when in reality, I might actually have a desperate need for others to like me. I might have a very fragile self-esteem and self-concept, and this is all a mask. But I am, I gotta tell you, my ex was like this, and I felt like he had an ego the size of the fucking Grand Canyon, and I couldn't keep up with it. Like, he needed me to praise and compliment and admire him and bow down to him so much. I was like, dude, you are not a freaking king. And I don't even know that I support that kind of conduct for kings. And so I just could not ever, his need for praise and appreciation was insatiable. And I just could never be enough. And it was freaking exhausting. And then also, like, his sense of entitlement and superiority, and he could do no wrong. And that's not uncommon. He gets credit for everything good, and he never, ever accepted responsibility for anything bad. And so that's common, where they choose not to recognize the needs of others. They choose to dismiss or disregard. They often are not empathetic to how other people feel. They're often not sensitive to other people's needs in relationships. They actually may be exploitative and prey upon people that will give and give and give. And they can become very jealous of others who are more successful than them in any aspect of life. And jealous of their accomplishments, jealous of their success, jealous of, whether someone likes them more. And so it can become a very, very exhausting and competitive relationship. And unfortunately, they have a really hard time acknowledging that they might be the source of any challenges. And so that makes it really difficult to work out problems and conflict. Okay, so let me go back and focus on, antisocial, lack of regard, empathy, and a general carelessness toward others, and maybe even a willful, intentional hurtfulness toward others. Histrionic, unstable unstable emotional expression, and a need to be, the center of attention, and then narcissistic personality, an over exaggerated, grandiose sense of self, and self-importance and superiority over others, and then emotionally unstable personality disorder, where they have or borderline personality disorder, where they have very hot and cold personality expressions, so centered on attachment and insecurity, centered on superiority and excessive, maybe false, high self-esteem, centered on attention, and centered on lack of emotion and a moral consciousness altogether. Okay, so let's move on to cluster C, and we'll start with avoidant personality disorder. So avoidant personality disorder, these individuals have such high degrees of social anxiety, often because they don't feel like they're good enough, they're inadequate, and they're so concerned about being judged by others that they just avoid relationships altogether. Now, this is different than the previous disorder where we talked about they just don't have an interest, right? These people have an interest, but they're so afraid of being negatively judged by others that they avoid relationships altogether. So that fear of rejection is at the core of this particular personality. It drives this disorder. And they will go to great lengths to avoid being judged by others, so they avoid relationships. That intense fear is all-consuming. It's not something that they can control. It may even hinder their ability to maintain work. And they have very small, if any, social circles and friends because they're afraid that their friends will negatively judge them as well. So they don't want to go anywhere where they might be criticized or critiqued or embarrassed. So they're very hesitant to try new things or try new relationships. And again, it's that occupation and almost obsessiveness with criticism. And that doesn't necessarily mean they don't have social skills. They just don't want to be put in a position where they're socially judged. So they typically don't have deficits, but sadly, that incredible fear and obsessive fear of negative judgments keeps them from exercising, practicing those social skills and establishing healthy sexual relationships. I mean, not sexual, social relationships. It's a little bit of my human sexuality class merging in. Then there's dependent personality disorder. These individuals have an excessive need to be taken care of by others. So they are overly dependent. They're very clingy. They're very submissive. They don't want to do anything that might potentially disrupt or upset or compromise their relationship with the person that is caring for them. So whomever they're dependent on, they almost will lose their own voice and their own identity and their own will, and submit to that dependent person wholly and entirely, or that person on whom they're dependent, so they don't lose that person. They don't want to upset them. They don't want them to lose them or abandon them in any way. And so they don't make their own decisions. Instead, they're constantly needing others to make their decision for them. They're constantly needing to consult with others before they can make decisions. And they effectively turn over control of their entire lives to other people. Maybe that's a parent, maybe that's a spouse, maybe that's a sibling, but they don't challenge the decisions of those people. Instead, they completely submit to them out of fear of losing them. If a relationship does end, maybe even someone passes away, oh my gosh, they feel entirely helpless, completely vulnerable, and they might seek out someone else that they can be dependent on as a replacement as quickly as possible. So I can very rarely do things for myself. I need someone. I need that person on whom I'm dependent to do it for me, to guide me, to support me. So consequently, I may not have a sense of confidence. I may not have a sense of empowerment. I may not have a good, strong sense of self-efficacy because I'm completely helpless and dependent upon others. and I desperately seek out support from others, and I might even do things that I don't want to do, that I don't like to do, just so that I can win the support and reassurance of others around me. And then there's obsessive compulsive personality disorder. Now, I know a lot of people refer to themselves as OCD when they are like excessively clean, okay? They likely have OCPD, not OCD. When you're talking about OCD, there are literal obsessions, cognitive obsessions that cause anxiety to rise. And then there's compulsions and behaviors. Now, the obsessions are cognitive thoughts, and they're coupled with anxiety. And then compulsions now are behaviors. So I might lock a door 5 times, and that alleviates this obsessive thought that I'm not safe and the anxiety that goes along with it. So the compulsions are behaviors that help to reduce the obsessions and anxiety that's resulting from those obsessions. And so it becomes a reinforcing cycle. With obsessive compulsive personality disorder, they don't have those obsessions and compulsions, but they are preoccupied with orderliness, cleanliness, perfectionism, control, a type A to the max, right? Where they're not flexible, they're not open, and it's all about efficiency, control, and they want details, rules, structure, and schedule, and sometimes they can suck the joy out of things, right? Because go on a trip with them, do something with them, and they're so demanding, and we have to stay on task, and we have to stay on schedule, and everything has to be perfect, and I didn't clean this well enough or do this right. And so consequently, it's like, well, shit, I'm not going to do it at all, right? So they impose those standards not just on themselves, but on others around them, which then does have a negative effect on their relationships, right? It also means that they might be so obsessed on these things that they don't get to just enjoy and balance life. They might take so much time on one task, trying to make it absolutely perfect, they don't have time to do other things. And they miss out on life. And they might also cause you to miss out on life if you have these people in your life. They may not even actually seek support and help from others because they don't believe anyone's competent enough to do the job to the standards that they want it done. And so they can come across as very rigid, very stubborn, very particular, very uptight, and very demanding. And as I mentioned, those standards are imposed not just on themselves, but on others. And so it can definitely impact their relationships. Might even impact how they're living their own life, because they might be excessively frugal, and when it spills into their finances, they live well below their means so that they can be planning for their financial security and future down the road. Okay, so that is all of them from cluster C, avoidant personality disorder, where they avoid relationships because of that fear, that obsessive fear of rejection. Dependent personality disorder, where they're actually very clingy and needy and hand over control of their lives to someone on whom they're dependent. And then obsessive compulsive personality disorder, where they're obsessed with cleanliness, control, structure, orderliness, efficiency, and that perfectionism and that obsessive control can hinder their ability to enjoy life and their relationships as well. So that's all of the personality disorders. Now we're going to talk a little bit about treating personality disorders. Know that personality disorders are hard to treat, but not impossible to treat. And we're gaining more and more empirical research on the best ways to treat different disorders and different approaches that are appropriate for different disorders. But we do talk about egocentric, which is when we talk about an individual where their ideas kind of are compatible with their own values, right? Their own way of thinking, even if it's highly distorted, right? So certain traits, behaviors can be egocentric, where they align with my own ideas, my own conceptions, and my own values. They can be ego-dystonic, where I have thoughts, impulses, and behaviors that are distressing, may even be repugnant and unacceptable to me, and they don't align with my self-concept. And so how you treat disorders is different, whether or not they're egocentric or ego-dystonic, right? If they're ego-dystonic to some extent, one recognizes that these types of thoughts and behaviors and emotions are distressing and unhealthy, and they may want to, they may actually have a commitment or desire to change those traits. When they're egocentric, they may actually even, I might have these grandiose ideas that are distorted, but they're acceptable to me. They're compatible with my values. And so those might be a little bit more challenging to break through, even if your partner or your relationships are showing distress. So when we talk about treating personality disorders, know that they're very difficult to treat, particularly if an individual is unwilling to acknowledge that there's anything that even needs treating, right? It's really hard to get someone to grow and change when they can't acknowledge faults within themselves, when they don't see themselves as the problem, but everyone else is the problem, or when they have fears and paranoia and they have trust issues, and so they don't trust you, even their therapist, in helping to address the problems. Or when they are so dependent, they don't know how to have their own voice, and so they allow the therapist now to do things. And therapy and growth and healing needs to be something that is actively engaged by the individual, right? Like, a therapist doesn't heal me. A therapist gives me the tools and resources and guidance for me to heal myself. It has to come from me. There has to be a willingness and a commitment on my part, because I don't live in the therapy office for my entire life. I have to go into the world, and so I have to be willing to change my mindsets. I have to be willing to change my coping mechanisms. I have to be willing to learn new social strategies. I have to be willing to reframe how I'm interpreting a particular behavior. And if I'm not willing to acknowledge that my interpretations might be off, then I'm not going to be able to move forward in a healthy, constructive way. So sadly, individuals with personality disorders may not be fully aware of their disorder or their problematic behavior. They may not be willing to acknowledge those challenges and opportunities for growth, and they may never seek treatment. Now, they often may not seek treatment for the disorder, but they might seek treatment for the problemed relationships or with the other behaviors that might be contributing to problems in their lives, right? Or maybe they have court-mandated treatment because, like, they've engaged in, delinquent behavior as juveniles, and so they're forced into treatment for other reasons as well. And then also, again, as I noted, some of the personality disorders, it's very distressing to the people. For instance, borderline personality and avoidant personality disorders, very distressing. They're aware of their own suffering. And so they might seek treatment for that suffering, and then the diagnosis of the disorder comes into play. But when we're talking about personality disorders, how can we as individuals with disorders cope? But also how can we as individuals who know someone with a disorder better cope? Get educated, right? Psychoeducation. So your learning activity is going to be to develop an infographic that can be part of that education process. Educating yourself while you're creating it and educating others by sharing. So educating yourself, practicing self-care, practicing wellness, taking care of your physical health, having healthy hobbies, stimulating your mind cognitively, intellectually, treating yourself to healthy, fun, enjoyable social activities and relationships. Avoiding drug and alcohol use altogether, because you're at a greater risk of abusing these disorders, and you are abusing these substances and using them as an unhealthy coping mechanism. And then using relaxation and stress management techniques, mindfulness, deep breathing, meditation, all of those things can be wonderful ways to gain a sense of awareness and control over your mind, so it's not running away with you, so you don't get lost in that paranoia, so you don't get lost in those obsessive thoughts, right? Developing healthy hobbies, outlets, releases for you, whether it's art, painting, exercise, but not in a compulsive way, not in a way where you're demanding yourself to be perfect and you're holding yourself to an unachievable high standard, but just as an outlet, an opportunity for expression and freedom. Talk to your loved ones, healthy communication, having conversations, talking about boundaries, sharing your emotions and concerns before they become, volatile, before it gets out of hand. Spending quality time with people you love, people with whom you feel safe, people that give you joy, joining a support group for others that may struggle with a similar disorder or another psychological disorder, and then get therapy, get help, seek help, talk to a professional, get medication as needed and or therapy as needed. And then one last consideration is dialectical behavioral therapy, often used for borderline personality disorder. In fact, it was developed specifically by Dr. Linehan and some colleagues to treat borderline personality disorder. It's a variation of cognitive behavioral therapy where they focus on both the cognitions and the behaviors, and they, through group skills training, through individual therapy, through ongoing telephone coaching, even when you're not in a therapy session, and through a team of therapists that consult with each other and strategize and brainstorm and give each other ideas, they actually then are able to provide more comprehensive treatment and support for you, usually over a period of 1 year. It can be very expensive because it lasts so long. It's based on this concept that all things are connected, right? Change is constantly occurring, and you can balance opposites and bring in, small integrated changes that will eventually take you where you need to be. And so there's this partnership between the therapist and the individual to find, to call out, like, I'm paranoid. Let's say I have borderline personality, and I'm paranoid that you're going to leave me. I'm insecure. And so, okay, let's address that, but let's also address the opposite. But you've been in a 10-year relationship. That person has never made attempts to leave you before, but they're still here. They're coming to therapy with you. They're still showing support and love for you. So, bringing those opposite perspectives into, one conversation dialogue, and we can promote a reframing of this, an acceptance of this, provide balanced thinking where I can counter this. This is like all or none, right? I'm leaving, I'm loved, I'm hated, and say, no, we can still have concerns, still want to address problems, but still love you. That doesn't mean I'm leaving you, right? It means I want to have a conversation so we can have a healthy relationship moving forward. And so that's what the therapists try to do in dialectical behavioral therapy. Validate the emotions, because those are real, but then also offer some added perspective so we can have a balanced assessment of the situation moving forward. And in the process, teaching acceptance, and teaching skill sets that embrace this concept of change so I can have healthy interpersonal relationships. I can manage and regulate my emotions more effectively. I can develop a tolerance for discomfort and distress without going to an extreme in my mind. And then I can also practice mindfulness, where I'm focusing on the present and I'm not allowing my thoughts to run away with me and take me off into these other tangents that may not be grounded in core, healthy, realistic assessments. So that's a general idea of dialectical behavioral therapy. As we close out this chapter, I want you to kind of take some wisdom from these two quotes. First, the sad thing is, nobody ever really knows how much anyone else is hurting. We could be standing next to somebody who is completely broken and we wouldn't even know it. I want this class to teach you empathy toward others. I teach abnormal and clinical psychology through a lens of empathy. And individuals with personality disorders can be very stressful to be around, but know that they also are hurting. So show compassion and kindness. Additionally, it hurts so bad when you have a fear of abandonment caused by a mental disorder, but it's that same mental disorder that causes people to walk out of your life. I have supported loved ones with mental disorders. I struggled with my own PTSD at periods of my life, and people have had to support me. And so, again, it's challenging, but through love, compassion, and support, and the help of a therapist, we can overcome personality disorders, and we can get better. And so I'm sending all of you much love and aloha as you've taken the time to learn more about your own personalities and now exploring some of the disorders that might emerge with personality, also giving you some hope that those things can be addressed, and we can embrace a healthier self and healthier relationships moving forward. Much love and aloha to all of you.